Now, the views and opinions expressed during RealBlackTalk.com do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CCTV, the Cambridge, the community, the television.
Hello and welcome to the BeLive Studios at Cambridge Community TV. And this is our monthly series of healing communities through the arts from the Institute for Arts and Health at Lesley University. And I'm here today with Dr. Vivian Marcow Spicer. Here we are. Professor of Expressive Therapies and one of the pioneers in dance movement therapy here in the United States and in Israel. And Vivian is going to talk to us about her model of trauma that she's used for the past almost 50 years in many places. And it began for Vivian in Israel. Why don't I just turn it right over to you, and you can talk about how this all began for you.
Well, I began my work in Israel following the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when I began to work as a volunteer at Beit Levenstein, which is a rehab hospital in Ra'anana, the town that I was living in. And I began to believe that in order for me to do effective work with the soldiers who were coming in with all sorts of injuries and suffering from all sorts of war trauma, I decided that since I couldn't get the training that I needed in Israel at the time, I came across to the United States, to Boston, and I enrolled in the expressive therapy program at Lesley University in 1975 when the program was just beginning, and I trained to become a dance therapist. And then after I graduated from Lesley, I went back to Israel and I started a training program in Israel that was affiliated with Lesley University. And that program continued for 34 years in Israel, and we had our last graduation last year in 2014.
After 35 years.
After 35 years.
And training how many students?
We've trained probably close to 3,000 creative arts therapists in Israel. There are approximately 5,000 creative arts therapists in Israel, and I would say that the greater majority of those creative arts therapists trained at it was then Lesley College. Later it became Lesley University's program in Israel. And to give you a sense of the differences, the population of Israel currently is about 7.5 million. And what's the population in the United States? 700 million? Something like that. And there's something like 25,000 creative arts therapists of all the genres in the United States: music therapy, art therapy, dance therapy, psychodrama, all of the expressive arts therapy, all of those therapies. 25,000 creative arts therapists in this country to 5,000 creative arts therapists in a population of roughly 7.5 million. So the creative arts therapies have really taken root in Israel, and Lesley University has been a big part of that taking root.
And I know that many of the graduates of the program in Israel have gone on to do very significant work in trauma.
Throughout the world. Pretty much. And many of them are affiliated with a group that we'll talk about in a future interview called Israel, which is an Israeli disaster relief organization, of which our Lesley University Israeli alums play a significant part.
Right. Well, let's go back to the beginnings, and even in 1973, we were just talking. There were no real trauma trainings. There was no real trauma work being done, per se. We really didn't know a whole lot about what that meant, and yet there was a huge need for it. You recognized that, and you started to do some work in Israel around that.
Right, and I think that the heart of the work that we do with the creative arts therapies when we work with trauma has to do with people telling their stories and creating opportunities and structures, and both informally and formal structures for people to tell the stories. I think that what we know today about trauma and its neurological effects on the brain, we know that through the body you get to work with trauma, that the body stores the traumatic memories, and when the traumatic memories are spoken about, that's when trauma begins its transformational passage and begins to shift. So I think that the service that we did to a small country like Israel around using the expressive arts therapies in the service of trauma has been very impactful on the whole country.
And I know that in that beginning time, you started to work with a lot of the war veterans that were returning from the wars that took place at that time. I know over time that in the beginning there was no ability to work with Israelis and Palestinians, but through your efforts, particularly, you have tried hard to make those connections, and in fact you've set up several conferences and forums throughout the years, trying to bring some reconciliation between the two countries.
Mm-hmm. So before I get to talk about some of the conferences and the community outreach efforts that we engaged in over the years to bring Israelis and Palestinians together, I want to talk just for a moment about the conference that we did in 1982. And in 1982, the Lesley University Extension in Israel held its first conference at a kibbutz called Shvaim, and it was during the invasion of Lebanon, the first war in Lebanon, and that was a war where there was widespread opposition to the war. In the middle of that war, there were 1 million people who demonstrated against the war, and many of the men who were demonstrating against the war were also in military uniform. So at the first international conference, which we held in Kibbutz Shvaim in 1982, many of the participants were wearing military uniforms, and the late great Peter Rowan, that's the psychodramatist who was affiliated with Lesley, who has since that time passed. He did a psychodrama around the war and around the trauma that one of the soldiers who was fighting in that war had encountered in previous wars, and it was the most powerful piece of psychodrama I have ever witnessed until today. We really got a chance early on, before the creative arts therapies were used extensively in working with trauma and building resilience. We got to see early on how effective these modalities were for it.
And that reminded me, one of our other graduates, also a psychodramatist, did a lot of work with Holocaust survivors in Germany as well, and working with children of Nazi soldiers and children of Holocaust survivors.
Yaakov Naor.
Yeah,
Also
very powerful.
Incredibly important and very, very powerful work with children of Nazis and Holocaust survivors.
Yeah, really important. So you mentioned this conference in 1982, and I know you've done other forums and conferences as well. Do you want to move on to some of those?
Sure. So let's talk about the Imagine conference from 2006. And in about 2005, during the height of the Intifada in Israel, there was a group of Lesley faculty sitting around a conference table here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, feeling absolutely frustrated about what was going on with the amount of pain it was causing for both Israelis and Palestinians. And we said, what can we do about this? We feel like we cannot just sit around and do nothing. So we got together, and a group of us imagined a conference called Imagine, Expression in the Service of Humanity. And we brought together all of the creative arts therapy groups and the group psychotherapy groups, and we managed to bring together a group of about 250 Israelis, Palestinians, and international folks who came together to imagine with us how we could use creative approaches to working with conflict in groups, and most specifically in working with Israelis and Palestinians. And it was in one of these moments where there was the possibility of imagining a peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians, and we were fortunate enough through the Shimon Peres Center to get funding to bring in Palestinian participants, and we were able to bring in 40 Palestinian mental health workers from the West Bank and from Gaza who were part of the conference. And you were there, so
Yeah.
you know as well as I do how wonderful and painful it was at the same moment. How in order to begin to build bridges between Israelis and Palestinians, we came together as a community where we were willing to share our thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams and fears for the future. And
You
there
can see
we
here
are.
in this photograph.
There we are, sitting around in round tables, and every round table was co-facilitated by an Israeli and a Palestinian. And we had keynote lectures, and following the keynote lectures, there were round table conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the friendships that were forged between Israelis and Palestinians continued. And there you see one of the round tables being where it was co-facilitated by Sam Schwartz, who you can see is wearing the kippah. He's a religious Jew, and his partner, who is Palestinian. They co-facilitated their particular group, and they co-wrote an article together, which we actually published in the journal.
Yeah, great. And also part of this, we had some very special presentations. This was one of them, the Children's Choir of Tel Aviv. Is that what it was?
We started the conference at the Tel Aviv Museum, and we had the mayor of Tel Aviv who spoke, and Shlomo Gornick, who is not in the photograph, is a very, very important Israeli artist, and this is his children's choir from Jaffa. It's mixed Israeli and Palestinian, so we opened with these kids singing together.
And then we also had Zubin Mehta create a very special symphony just for the conference.
Right. The Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra partnered with us around creating this special concert event for the conference, and Zubin Mehta and Pinchas Zuckerman came to the conference and presented together with the Palestinian member of the orchestra.
Right.
And all of the conference participants went to a special concert piece that the Israeli Philharmonic held for us.
And I noticed you put in another slide. This was something I was involved in, leading this group of Palestinians and Israelis in circle dancing, and you can see some of these different slides here. There I am, leading this. And I guess, you can see some of the excitement. This was a performance that you did with some people that came to the conference. You want to say something about this performance?
Sure. This was part of a larger performance which a group of us had done in Boston together with our mentor, Norma Canna, and it was a piece about searching through the ashes in Cambodia.
Yeah.
A woman searching through the ashes for the bones of her child. And the piece is called Bones of the Earth. So together with some of my dance therapy colleagues, we recreated bones and ashes from the bones for the Israeli conference.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the late Norma Canna is the person who inspired a beautiful poem by the poet Elizabeth McKim. And Elizabeth writes, "It takes an agile guide to cross a fragile bridge." And Elizabeth said that for her agile guide was Norma Canna and the work that Norma did with dance therapy.
It was a very powerful piece. I witnessed it. It was incredibly powerful and spoke to really the potential of the arts to represent, depict, and bring some sense of inner healing, or at least the beginnings of it, for communities. And I'm noticing this next slide here, which is a real beginning of bringing communities together. Who are these people in this slide, and why are they here?
Well, I'm holding the hands of Karen Barzilai Schechter, who is Israeli, and Yosef Alajarma, who is Palestinian. And both Karen and Yosef did their doctoral work together at Lesley, and they crossed that fragile bridge together. Their doctoral work was focused on a performance piece that the two of them created about what it means for Israelis and Palestinians to come together to confront one another about issues of deep pain, and to use creative process as a way of being able to work together and together hold the pain of what it means to be an Israeli and a Palestinian. They were able to transform it. They weren't able to resolve it. There's some conflicts, like the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, that are intransigent. And after the war last summer in Gaza, it's particularly painful to even begin to think about the divide that gets only larger and larger. But individuals like Karen and Yosef, who continue to work together, who continue to be fast friends, whose families continue to be fast friends, give all of us the hope that we need for the future.
And so, speaking of that, so after this conference, and it was in some ways a difficult conference, there were a lot of difficult feelings presented, and yet we began the conversations that needed to happen. We began to have the performances and the arts instilled as a way to touch some of these difficult subjects. And a few years later, you put together another conference and with Palestinian and Israeli youth. You want to say something about that? I have a photo here that
Sure.
we'll put up on the screen here.
So this was a conference that we organized around the idea of a peace train. And the woman playing guitar in the center is a woman called Sharon Katz. And Sharon Katz is a musician who comes from South Africa. And when Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1995, I believe, Sharon put together a 500-piece children's choir across the Rainbow Nation, and they toured South Africa and performed for Nelson Mandela and Al Gore and all the dignitaries. And it was an incredible experience, and we brought Sharon several times to Israel. We did a lot of work with the Ethiopian Jewish community and with the Israeli-Palestinian communities with Sharon. And one day, I found myself in Beacon, New York, and there was a man with a long, long ponytail carrying a banjo, and we followed him into an event he was going into, and he knew Sharon and the Peace Train because he had endorsed their work in South Africa.
And of course, this was Pete Seeger.
Of course, this was the late, great Pete Seeger.
Right.
So I said to him, Sharon Katz, who of course he knew, I said, she's coming to Israel, and we're going to do some work with the Israelis and Palestinians. And he said, he said, I betcha, he said, that if you could get Israeli and Palestinian kids to come on a peace train, they'll do more for peace than any politicians can do. So we did that. It was complicated. These things are always complicated to do. And we couldn't bring Israeli and Palestinian kids together on a peace train to Lesley University in Israel, because if they would have come on the train, the Palestinian kids would have been searched in stringent kinds of ways, and we didn't want to do that to them. So we actually hired a bus. It was a peace bus. That brought them to the campus, and we made songs together, and you were there, you were playing.
Yeah. Here's a photo of me playing with them.
There's a picture of Mitchell playing with Sharon and the kids. And the kids came from a variety of Palestinian and Israeli programs in Israel.
Mm-hmm. And we created songs together, first spontaneously, made up the words, sang them, and then created art from that. I don't think we have any photographs of the artwork, but this again was another, they're the groups with Sharon. Again, this was an incredible moment in time, a very important moment addressing important issues of trauma that that these young adolescents live every day.
Right. And how it is that when they come together to create in music making, in songwriting, in drawing, how it is that they are able to build empathic bridges of connection between them.
And this continues on with another graduate of our program here in Cambridge, actually, Deb Nathan, who has this group called ArtsBridge, and she continues to work with these groups and bring them together. So this was not just a one-time event that then leaves the air, and we continue to have connections as well.
Right, and there are a lot of programs like this. For example, Kids for Peace, which also works on bringing Israeli and Palestinian kids together and having them work on various projects.
Right.
The conference following that conference was the Arts and Activism Conference, which we did in 2011, and that conference was one of the most powerful conferences we ever did. The way that we held conferences in Israel was really a community outreach effort where we wanted to, as broad a public as possible, demonstrate how the arts could be used in working with trauma and towards building resilience. So at this particular conference, it was held the week after Juliana Kamp's mayor had been murdered. And Juliana Mayer was a drama person, and he was working with kids in refugee camps and on creating drama.
Right.
He had been murdered that week, so when we began the conference, we began with a memorial to him. And from the very first moment, the audience split into those people who felt like he got what he deserved because he was a political activist, and people who were mourning his loss. So from the very first moment, that conference was off to a rocky start. And there was an event that happened that you were inadvertently a part of, where one of our alums, she was actually both a master's student alum and a doctoral student alum, a woman by the name of Tammy Einstein. For her doctoral work, she had created a code that brought together Palestinian and Israeli images. It had parts of the Palestinian flag in it, parts of the Israeli flag on it, and there you are trying the code on. And because of these strong political symbols that were embedded in the code was very, very controversial. And the audience, which all day had been festering and at odds with itself, the audience totally began to attack each other. Pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian, anti-Israeli sentiment, and an audience that was fighting with itself. And Tammy Einstein did the most brilliant intervention I have ever seen anybody make. Everybody was shouting at each other, and she turned to them and she said, "Hey," she said, holding up the code, "I am the person who brought in the code," she said, "talk to me." And in that moment, everybody settled down again. But that's what it was like in Israel, as you know. It's like 1 minute everything is calm and people are relating empathically and connected to each other, and the next moment something happens, you never know what it's going to be, something happens and everybody is restless and in pain again.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to get to this last conference that you did, which was one of the largest in Israel just a couple of years ago. It's called the Arch of the Arts in Health. And just say a few words about that before we have to sign off here.
So the Arch of Arts in Health was an initiative where we brought this newly emerging field of arts and health to Israel. Lesley University, we were the people who brought expressive therapies to Israel in the first place. And just as Lesley University was phasing out of its involvement with Israel, we brought in other ways of being able to look at how the arts can be used towards healing and towards working with trauma and building resilience. So
we have about a minute left. That music's not going to go away. And I don't know if there was a poem you wanted to read.
Yes.
Let me see if I can just neutralize this. Here we go.
So I would like to conclude by reading a stanza from a poem by Yuda Amichai, who is an Israeli poet of much prominence, who is very much concerned with peace. And this poem that is called Wild Peace, and this is the last stanza of it. He says, "Let it come like wildflowers, suddenly, because the field must have it, wild peace." And so the work we do with the arts, I think, is devoted to building wild peace in every community we come in contact with.
Wild peace and resilience and ways to express and ways to address very difficult issues.
Mm-hmm.
And your work in Israel has arced over more than 40 years. And I know we didn't get a chance to talk about this today, but your work here in Cambridge and in this community also has had a large effect. So thank you for being with us today. We appreciate you being here. And we are going to continue with this forum in a few weeks. And hopefully you will tune in and hear more about the important work that many people are doing here in Cambridge and around the world. Thank you. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you for joining us.